So while at first it doesn't look like much, the first spring ephemeral kind of plant that I would talk about is this just broad-leaved green plant here. There's a couple of them here, smaller ones here. There's a nice large one developing here right at the base of this tree. Just basic broad leaves coming out. Underneath there's a bulb. There's a bulb there because it's actually related to onions. This plant is Allium tricoccum, sometimes called leeks, sometimes called ramps. But either way, Allium tricoccum is in the onion family, the alliums. As a consequence, this plant smells and tastes like very strong onions. I knew this plant as a kid. My dad showed it to me in the forest, and he would make us sandwiches and have us try it as kids, and we stunk like onions when we went back to my mother. Anyhow, this plant smells like onions, and a lot of the alliums do to deter insects or other herbivores from eating the leaves. The way they do this is they imbue sulfur compounds into their foliage, and it's those sulfur compounds that give onions their characteristic smells. And so this one also is very, very potent as far as its smell and taste. Now later in the year, these leaves come out first. Then they wither away as the canopy comes out on the trees. Currently, it's gaining the sunlight that it can while the leaves are not out on the trees. But when the canopy comes and this is put in the shade, that's when the flower stem will start to emerge. The leaves will disappear, and from this base, a flower stem will emerge about this high and put out a number of little tiny white flowers on a small head. Those flowers are pollinated by flies, bees, and a number of other insects in our forests. Eventually, that flower head will eventually produce seeds, and on each little tip of the flower head will be a black, BB-like seed. Now those seeds, they bounce. If you take a handful of them and you throw them on like a tile floor, they bounce quite readily. The adaptation is thought that those seeds will bounce through the leaf litter or through the winter snowpack as the stem persists through the winter and kind of just sits there. Occasionally, the following spring, you can even find the stem still persistent, and occasionally some seeds still hanging on. The seeds, they'll roll through the leaf litter and need to make their way to the soil, or eventually they'll germinate and produce these leaves like this. Now, Allium tricoccum is edible. However, I don't encourage people to eat this plant from the wild. This plant, if you find a colony of it, it's possible to forage it sustainably only if you take 10% of the colony and then you leave it for 10 years. That's a long time, and so consequently these plants can quickly be poached. So I don't encourage taking them from the wild. It is possible to grow them in your yard if you gather the seeds, and then you can harvest them or grow them as you'd like that way. So again, Allium tricoccum, and there's another variation with reddish stems, which is a little bit different. So there's two kind of like subspecies or versions of this plant. So this is the other variation of Allium tricoccum that I was mentioning. The other one, as you saw, had very narrow leaves, and these ones are quite broad. They're very broad-leafed. But more than that, if you look at the petiole, the stem of the leaf itself, it's reddish. And that's definitely different from the other variety that I showed earlier. The stem is red like this. And so it's wider, and the stem is red, but virtually everything about this plant is the same as the other Allium tricoccum that I showed you earlier. And as you can see, it's already starting to, the seeds, again, they roll down the hillside and they roll along the leaf litter and bounce. And so as a consequence, it starts uphill, and then you can kind of see how it's making its way down this slope here. Unfortunately, this patch is being threatened by lesser celandine, winter creeper, and a number of other invasive plants like multiflora rose or honeysuckle. So just in this area here, there's more invasive species than there are native species. That's a problem, and we definitely need to get on top of this, because we will lose our native flora, and what we'll end up with is a mess of non-native plants that don't do very much for our local ecosystem at all. So again, Allium tricoccum, and this is the other variety here.